It's funny the things you do for a good grade. The stupid risks you take when you're young and you think you're made of something other than bone and fragile nerves. I was 20 years old back in the fall of 2003. Going to a community college just outside of Boston, and I had this photography professor. A guy named Mr. Albright. He was one of those intense, world-weary types who always wore a black turtleneck and talked about the brutal honesty of the image. His final project for the semester was an open-ended assignment called The Architecture of Abandonment. The goal was to capture a place that had been left behind by time. To tell its story through images of decay. Most kids in my class picked easy stuff. An old gas station on a forgotten highway. A collapsed barn out in the countryside. But I wanted to impress Albright. I wanted that so I started digging around online. Back when the internet was still a bit of a wild west. Full of GeoCities pages and unfiltered forums. And that's when I first read the name, Danvers State Hospital. The more I read, the more it hooked me. It wasn't just an abandoned building, it was a legend. A place built on a hill with the best of intentions. A sprawling Gothic masterpiece designed according to the Kirkbride plan, which held that beautiful architecture and serene surroundings could help heal the mentally ill. It was a noble idea, but the reality, as it so often is, was much, much darker. The place opened in the 1870s and was almost immediately overwhelmed. By the mid-20th century, it was a warehouse for the unwanted. A building designed for 600 people was crammed with over 2.400 souls. The stories that bled out from its walls were the stuff of nightmares. Tales of patients chained in unheated rooms. Of brutal hydrotherapy treatments where people were submerged in ice water for days. Of electroshock therapy administered without anesthetic. And then there was the most infamous procedure of all, the prefrontal lobotomy. The act of severing connections in the brain with a tool that looked disturbingly like an ice pick. Slid in through the patient's eye socket. Danvers was one of the birthplaces of that particular horror. Online forums for urban explorers were filled with warnings and whispered legends. They talked about the unmarked graves of patients who had died from neglect or from the treatments. They talked about the vast network of steam tunnels that ran beneath the entire complex. A dark labyrinth where it was said staff would move patients and bodies unseen. They talked about the feeling of the place. A heavy, oppressive sadness that clung to the very air. A feeling of being watched by 1,000 unseen eyes. To me, a cocky 20-year-old with a brand new Canon Rebel, this wasn't a warning, it was an invitation. This was it. This was my A+. This was the heart of the architecture of abandonment. I spent a week planning. I learned that the main buildings were sealed tight and there was a part-time security guard who patrolled the grounds. But the forums, if you knew where to look, had secrets. There were hand-drawn maps, blurry photos, and cryptic instructions. The most promising lead was an entry point into the steam tunnels on the far western edge of the property, hidden in a thicket of overgrown woods. From there, the maps showed a route that would allegedly lead you up into the basements of the main Kirkbride building itself. So, on a Tuesday morning in late October, I told my parents I was going to the library to study. Instead, I threw my camera bag, 2 heavy flashlights, extra batteries, and a bottle of water into the passenger seat of my beat-up 1994 Toyota Corolla and started the drive north. The day was perfect for it. In a grim sort of way. The sky was a solid sheet of gunmetal gray, and a cold, damp wind was stripping the last of the autumn leaves from the trees. The closer I got to the town of Danvers, the more the landscape seemed to change. The suburbs gave way to older, more weathered houses, and then, I saw it. The hospital was built on a high, isolated hill, deliberately set apart from the rest of the town. Even from a distance, it was monstrous. A sprawling red brick leviathan with towering spires and hundreds of dark, empty windows, like vacant eye sockets. It didn't look abandoned, it looked like it was waiting. I parked my car about a half-mile away, down a residential street, hoping it wouldn't look too out of place. The walk to the edge of the property was tense. I felt conspicuous, like every passing car was watching me. I clutched the strap of my camera bag, the cold metal of my flashlight a small comfort in my hand. I found the spot the online map had described, a break in a crumbling stone wall. I slipped through, and immediately, the world changed. The air grew still and quiet, the sound of traffic fading behind me. I was in a dense, tangled wood, the ground a soft carpet of rotting leaves. It smelled of damp earth and decay. I pushed through thorny bushes and low-hanging branches for what felt like an eternity. My eyes scanning the ground, following the crude map I'd printed out, and then I saw it. Exactly as described, a small, concrete structure, no bigger than a wellhead, almost completely consumed by ivy and moss. On one side, a heavy iron grate was bent upwards, just enough for a person to squeeze through. This was the entrance to the tunnels. My heart was hammering, a mixture of fear and adrenaline-fueled excitement. I remember thinking, this is the last chance to turn back. Just go home, pick the old gas station, get a B and move on with your life. But the thought of the photos, of the story I could tell, was too strong. I clicked on my main flashlight, took a deep breath, and slid through the opening. Feet first. The drop was only about 4 feet, and I landed with a soft thud on a packed dirt floor. The moment I was inside, the temperature plummeted. It was at least 20 degrees colder than it was outside, and the smell, it was overwhelming. It was the smell of the woods, damp earth, mold, and rot, but it was mixed with something else. Something acrid and metallic, like old rust, and something vaguely medicinal. Even after all these years, I swept my flashlight beam around. I was in a narrow, brick-lined tunnel, just tall enough for me to stand upright. Pipes, thick as my arm and wrapped in decaying asbestos insulation, ran along the ceiling and walls. The air was dead still. The only sound was the faint, steady drip, drip, drip of water somewhere in the darkness ahead. According to my map, I needed to head left for about 100 yards. Then look for a ladder on the right-hand wall. I started walking, my footsteps unnaturally loud in the profound silence. The flashlight beam cut a perfect, bouncing circle in the absolute blackness. It was a strange feeling, being so completely blind outside of that small cone of light. My entire world was reduced to a 10-foot circle of illuminated brick and dirt. This is where the first red flag, as they say, appeared. It was so small, so easy to dismiss, that I barely even registered it at first. As I was walking, I heard a sound. It was a faint, scraping noise, and it seemed to come from far ahead of me, deeper in the tunnel. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. My first thought was rational. It's an old building. The pipes are settling. Or maybe it was an animal. A raccoon or something, dragging something along the floor. I stopped walking and listened. The scraping stopped too. The only sound was the dripping water and the blood pounding in my ears. I stood there for a full minute, frozen, just listening. Nothing. Just the pipes. Jake, I whispered to myself, the sound of my own voice startling me. I kept moving, a little faster this time. The rational part of my brain was in control, but a deeper, more primal part was now on high alert. I found the junction the map had shown and turned right. And there it was, just as promised. A rusty iron ladder, bolted to the brick wall, ascending into a square of absolute darkness above. This was the way into the hospital proper. The ladder was cold and slick with moisture. I slung my camera bag over my shoulder, held the smaller backup flashlight in my mouth, and began to climb. Rung by rusty rung, the air grew thicker, heavier, the medicinal smell more pronounced. After about 15 feet, my head bumped against something solid. It was a heavy metal trapdoor. I pushed. It didn't budge. My heart sank. Had I come all this way for nothing? I pushed again, putting my shoulder into it, and with a deafening, groaning shriek of rusted metal, it gave way, swinging open into the darkness above. I hoisted myself up and out, scrambling onto a cold concrete floor. I was in the basement of the Kirkbride building. I took a moment to get my bearings, sweeping my main flashlight around the room. It was a vast, cavernous space filled with the hulking shapes of old machinery, boilers, maybe, or laundry equipment, all of it covered in a thick shroud of dust and cobwebs. The air here tasted stale, like a sealed tomb that had just been opened. I started to explore, moving from the basement up a wide, concrete staircase. Each floor I ascended brought me into the hospital itself. And it was breathtaking, in the most awful way possible. The scale of the place was immense. I emerged into a long, arched hallway, Sunlight, weak and gray, filtered through the massive, barred windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The paint was peeling from the walls in long, leprous strips. Doors to the patient rooms stood ajar, opening onto black squares of shadow. I pulled out my camera. This was exactly what I had come for. I started taking pictures. The way the light hit a row of empty, rusted bed frames, a close-up of a doll's head, bald and cracked, lying in a corner, the intricate, flaking patterns of the peeling paint. I was so engrossed in my work, so focused on angles and exposures, that for a little while, I forgot to be scared. I was an artist, an observer. I was documenting the decay. I wandered for what must have been an hour, moving through wards and day rooms. The silence was the most unnerving part. It wasn't just quiet, it was a dead, heavy silence that seemed to absorb sound. In one of the large, circular day rooms, I found something that gave me my second pause. In the center of this huge, debris-strewn room sat a single, small, wooden chair. It was a child's chair. Unlike everything else around it, it was clean, not sparkling clean, but it was free of the thick layer of dust and grime that coated every other surface. It looked as if someone had wiped it down that morning. I stood there, staring at it. It made no sense. Why would that one chair be clean? Who would do that? My mind raced for an explanation. Maybe another explorer, like me, had done it as a joke, to spook the next person who came along. It had to be that. I took a picture of it. It was a powerful image, but as the camera flash illuminated the room for a second, I felt a sudden, sharp pang of what I can only describe as profound loneliness. It was a feeling so intense and so foreign that it felt like it wasn't my own. I shook it off, telling myself the atmosphere of the place was just getting to me. I decided to push on. My goal was to find one of the most infamous parts of the hospital, the J ward. This was where they housed the most difficult patients, and where many of the most brutal procedures were said to have taken place. It was located in the attic levels of the building. As I made my way towards the central wing and started climbing the main staircase, the feeling of the hospital began to shift. The air grew colder again, and I started to hear things. At first, it was just the faintest whisper, the kind of sound you can't be sure you actually heard. It was a sibilant, shushing sound, like the drag of silk on a rough floor. It always seemed to be coming from just around the corner, or from inside a room I was about to pass. Every time I'd stop and hold my breath to listen, it would vanish. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was somehow worse. I was telling myself it was the wind, whistling through the broken window panes. It had to be the wind, but there was no wind inside the building. The air was perfectly still. I reached the top floor. A long, dark corridor stretched out before me, narrower and more oppressive than the ones below. This was the J ward. The doors here were heavier, made of thick wood with small, barred windows at eye level. This was where my skepticism finally began to crumble and chip away. Replaced by a cold, growing dread, I walked down the hallway, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. I shone it into one of the rooms. It was small, bare, with a single, heavy iron ring bolted to the center of the floor. There was nothing else inside. As I panned the light across the room, my beam caught something on the far wall. Scratches, hundreds, maybe thousands of them, gouged deep into the plaster. They formed a chaotic, desperate pattern, concentrated in an area about the size of a human body. It looked like someone had been clawing at that wall for a very, very long time. I backed out of the room, my throat suddenly dry, and that's when I saw it. It wasn't in the room. It was at the far end of the long hallway I was in. For a split second, as I turned, I saw a shape, a tall, slender silhouette, move from the center of the hall into the shadow of an open doorway. It was so fast, a mere flicker at the edge of my vision, that I wasn't sure I'd seen it at all. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded small and pathetic, swallowed by the immense silence. "Is someone there?" Of course, there was no answer. Now, my heart was a trip hammer against my ribs. The urban explorer persona was gone. The artist was gone. I was just a scared kid, alone and in a very, very bad place. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, to get out. But my curiosity, or maybe just my stupidity, was still fighting for control. It was a trick of the light. A shadow cast by your own flashlight. I had to be sure. I had to know what I saw. Slowly, deliberately, I began to walk down the hallway, towards the doorway where the shadow had disappeared. Each footstep was a conscious effort. The floorboards groaned under my weight. The air was icy cold now. So cold I could see my breath fogging in the beam of my flashlight. As I got closer to the doorway, I noticed a smell I hadn't smelled before. It was faint, but unmistakable. It smelled like lavender. Old, dried lavender. I reached the doorway and peered inside. The room was empty. Just another small, barren cell. There was nothing there. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. It was a trick of the light. I was letting this place get into my head. I felt a wave of relief. So strong it almost made me dizzy. I turned to leave, to head back the way I came. To get out of the J ward and out of this building forever. And as I turned, my flashlight beam swept across the wall opposite the doorway. And that's when I saw the handprint. It was on the wall. About shoulder height. It wasn't a dusty outline. It was a fresh, wet-looking print. A dark, greasy smear against the peeling paint. It looked like it had been made just seconds ago. And from the bottom of the palm, a single, dark, viscous drop was slowly, lazily, making its way down the wall. I didn't scream. I couldn't. The sound was trapped in my throat. A knot of pure, undiluted terror. My mind simply refused to process what I was seeing. The shadow, the whispers, the cold, the lavender smell, and now this impossible, undeniable proof that I was not alone. I abandoned all pretense of bravery. I turned and I ran. I wasn't just jogging. I was sprinting, my boots slamming against the wooden floors. The sound echoing through the dead halls. I didn't care about the noise anymore. I just wanted out. I flew down the main staircase, taking the steps 3 at a time, my camera bag bouncing painfully against my back. And the hospital seemed to come alive around me. A door at the bottom of the stairs. A heavy oak door that had been wide open when I came up. Slammed shut with a deafening boom right as I reached it. The sound shaking the entire stairwell. I didn't stop. I threw my shoulder into it. The impact rattling my teeth. And burst through into the main floor hallway. The whispers were back, but they weren't whispers anymore. They were voices. A chorus of faint, overlapping moans and cries, seeming to come from all directions at once. It was the sound of utter despair. I had to get to the basement. To the trapdoor. To the tunnels. That was the only way out. I scrambled through the decaying wards. My sense of direction completely shot. Every hallway looked the same. The layout of the Kirkbride building is intentionally disorienting. A sprawling maze of wings and corridors. In my panic, I was utterly lost. I'd run down a long hall, burst through a set of double doors, only to find myself in a part of the hospital I didn't recognize, a derelict kitchen. Maybe, or an old infirmary with beds lined up in neat, rotting rows. And all the while, I could feel it, the presence. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it pacing me, keeping just out of sight. I'd hear a soft footfall behind me, and I'd spin around to see nothing. A chair would scrape across the floor in an adjacent room. The sound was always calm, deliberate. It wasn't chasing me, it was hurting me. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of blind panic, I recognized a landmark. The circular day room with the single, clean child's chair in the center. I knew the way from here. The basement stairs were just down the next corridor. As I ran past the chair, I risked a glance at it, and my blood ran cold. Sitting on the seat of the small wooden chair was the doll's head I had seen and photographed earlier. In a different ward, on a different floor, its cracked, painted eyes seemed to be staring right at me. I didn't even slow down. I ran for the basement stairs, my lungs burning, tears of terror streaming down my face. I plunged down the concrete steps into the cool, damp darkness of the basement. The chorus of moans faded away as I descended, replaced again by the heavy, oppressive silence. I fumbled for the trapdoor, my hands shaking so badly I could barely direct the flashlight beam. I found the square opening in the floor, the top of the rusty ladder just visible. I didn't climb down. I jumped, landing hard on the packed earth of the steam tunnel, the shock of the impact jarring my whole body. I was back in the tunnels. I was almost safe. I turned on my heel and started running. Back the way I came. The only light was the bouncing circle of my flashlight. The only sound was my own ragged gasps for air and my frantic footsteps. And then I heard a new sound. It was coming from behind me. From the opening to the basement I had just jumped through. It was the sound of the iron ladder. A slow, rhythmic creak, 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 as someone, or something, began to climb down after me. That sound broke something inside of me. I ran with a kind of primal terror I have never felt before or since. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. I knew that if I looked back and saw what was on that ladder, I would die right there in the dark. My mind would simply snap. I ran and ran, my flashlight beam jittering wildly, illuminating fleeting images of brick and pipe and darkness. The scraping sound started again. Scrape, scrape. But it wasn't ahead of me this time. It was behind me. It was close. And it was getting closer. Then I saw it. A pinprick of gray light. Far down the tunnel. The exit. I have never run so hard in my life. It felt like I was running through water. The air thick and resistant. The scraping was right behind me now. A dry, rasping sound accompanied by a soft, wet, shuffling noise. I could almost feel a cold breath on the back of my neck. I burst out of the tunnel opening, clawing my way up into the overgrown thicket, not even feeling the thorns that tore at my clothes and skin. I was back in the outside world. The gray sky had begun to darken into twilight. The air was cold and clean. I didn't stop to breathe. I ran through the woods, back towards the road, back towards my car. I fumbled with my keys, my hands trembling uncontrollably, and finally got the door open. I threw myself inside, slammed the door, and locked it. I sat there for a moment, hyperventilating, my whole body shaking. I looked back at the woods. The entrance to the tunnel was hidden from view. Nothing moved. The woods were still and silent. I jammed the key in the ignition and my poor old Corolla started on the first try, for which I will be eternally grateful. I didn't drive away carefully. I peeled out, leaving a strip of rubber on that quiet residential street. And I didn't slow down until I was on the highway, surrounded by the comforting, normal glow of other cars' headlights. I drove straight home, the radio blasting, trying to drown out the memory of the silence and the sounds that had filled it. In the weeks that followed, I tried to rationalize it. I tried to convince myself it was all a product of an overactive imagination in a creepy place. But I couldn't. I developed the film from my camera. Most of the photos from the end of my expedition were a useless, blurry mess from my panicked flight. But the earlier ones were clear. The photo of the child's chair in the empty room was perfectly in focus, looking just as clean and out of place as I remembered. The photo of the doll's head was sharp, lying in its dusty corner. There was no way I could have moved it. The worst one, though, was a wide shot I had taken down one of the first hallways I explored. I had been trying to capture the sense of scale, the repeating pattern of doorways stretching into the darkness. When I first looked at the print, I didn't see anything, but when I looked closer, at the very end of the hall, deep in the shadows where the light from the windows couldn't reach, there was something there. It was blurry, indistinct, but it had a shape. A tall, thin shape, standing perfectly still, watching me from the darkness. I dropped out of the photography class. I took an incomplete. I couldn't explain to Mr. Albright why. I sold the camera. I never went back to Danvers, not even to look at it from the road. They finally tore most of it down a few years later, putting up apartments or condos or something. But they left the iconic front section of the Kirkbride building standing, a monument to what it once was. It's been over 20 years. I have a family now, a mortgage, a steady job. My life is normal, but the experience left a scar on me, a deep one. To this day, I can't stand being in a perfectly quiet house. I always have to have a TV or music on. Sometimes, when I'm up late at night, alone in the living room after everyone else has gone to bed, I'll hear a faint sound from another part of the house, a soft, scraping sound. And I'm never quite sure if it's just the house settling, or if it's a memory echoing up from that dark, dirt-floored tunnel. I know what I saw, and I know what I heard. I don't know what it was that followed me out of the basement of Danvers State Hospital that day. And I pray to God I never find out. But I know that whatever it was real, and a small part of me is terrified that not all of it stayed on that hill.